Good morning, well, good afternoon there. Again, thanks for coming. I was told that I have more time that I thought, so I was rushing a bit. We can take some of the issues at the end if you like. And today's lecture is monetary policy in developing economies. And I use the Mexican case, and I use it in the period which we called globalization and internationalization, which are two different features for us. The organization of the course is in two parts. The first part is the institutional organizations in which developing economy engage to industrialize. And I also want to spend some time in the main features of the Mexican economy in order to then go to monetary policy. I want, since I thought I had less time, I want to just expand what are what were the monetary policy instruments during the industrialization period by import substitution. Then again, very briefly, because somehow yesterday I laid out the basis of the monetary policy theory, which are the main arrangements of the export-led model or the globalization that takes place in our economies during the period of globalization and internationalization. And then I want to discuss central bank operations and its effect in the Mexican financial system. Here I want to show that the economy is so open that big capital interest imposes certain links in the central bank so as the private financial sector will be the ones who will be subsidized by the government in order to operate. This will be more or less what I want to do in today's lectures. As you, from yesterday, you can recall that monetary theory substance is the organization of the financial system. If we don't take into account the institutional factors, I don't think we can understand how money comes into the system and how it affects the system. It's not something neutral. It's not something that, as Friedman said, it comes out of the thin air and it's spread through the wind to people. The effects of money coming into economy and the effects of money coming out of the economy, meaning that money debts are destroyed, is significant in terms of the impact of the monetary system in the economic arrangement. History or economic historians tell us of two very broad financial organizations. The one called the famous Anglo-Saxon Saxon financial system, capital-based, and the other, the bank-based system used by countries that need to catch up development. Here we have Gershenkron, here we have the other two names, I forget, a very important one now, sorry, that write that banks issue credit for production. As we know, banks can only issue short-term credits, and capital markets provide long-term liquidity to finance capital goods or liquidity to non-liquid assets. So here it's the basis of the Anglo-Saxon system. It seems that it's banks on one side issuing money and capital markets providing long-term liquidity. In order that this system will operate, capital markets need to be broad and deep. And this is a very interesting discussion in terms that you need very many agents going into the market, many listed companies, but also a very wide range of instruments operating into the market. And this is in order that, or it assumes so that market forces determines financial instrument prices. This is the idea. And obviously, it's assumed that the public sector has a very reduced intervention in the financial market. So this part is how books tell us that the Anglo-Saxon financial system operates. Historically, we know through Cameron, Pollard, and other economic historians that capital markets really didn't finance industrialization. Industrialization, specifically in terms of England and the US, were financed by internal, sorry, I put twice here, internal funds were the main providers. So here we have in all this period of competitive organization, capital markets, although existed, didn't make a big substance in financing industrialization. It came, capital markets importance came very clearly at the end of the 19th century and specifically in the beginning of the 20th century. However, in periods where financial capital dominates economic, the economic environment, finance has a very special place in terms of firms' treasury activity, which firms use their treasuries to increase financial gain. This process was named by Veblen and others as overcapitalization, and Kalecki has some brief references to it before in the 1920s. So financial capital is important, especially when it dominates the productive sector. I want to finish this part arguing that capital market most important stance is that they are linked to oligopolistic structure, and there is an important discussion of capital centralization and concentration that initiated again Kalecki, but Steindl follow it and makes a very important difference between how small firms finances their development and the difference with big firms access to external capital to their firms. So I think this is the important issue, yeah, regardless of all the story that they tell us in terms of the Anglo-Saxon financial system. We can go on more on that, but I think this would be enough to set off the discussion. Then we have another financial organization, which is called the BankBased System. And it has been used by countries that need to catch up development. This is in terms of what has been named the second and third wave of industrialization, The second one referring to Germany, France, and other European countries. And the third one is more linked to Japan, Latin America, and in general, and also in the South Asia. So there are two financial organizations, and here banks are the main providers of finance, and its characteristics has been that its financial system has been very weak or highly regulated. From the beginning, we must lay that that there are two models: the famous German system based on universal banks, German and French system, I would argue, and what has been called the direct state intervention. I think in the German model, governments are very active in determining the market participants and secure that commercial bank seats in the corporation boards of and thereby creating economic groups. This is in terms of what has been written on Germany in the Universal Bank, and in France of the beginning of the 20th century. I think it was the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century seems very important, and certainly was a model that Hitler used for financing this rapid, horrific industrialization that they did. In this sense, the public intervention is very limited in terms of who is going into the, who are the players in the market, and setting the rules that capital and financial need to be grouped. In the direct state intervention, which I mean East Asia and Latin America, the public sector mobilizes long-term resources, and I call it that they do it through some compensatory mechanism. What I mean by that? The public sector finances most of the industrialization process, and it does it through development banks that are able to issue long-term finance. Also, are very important, the public's trust, and in that period, were imposed credit policies, and these credit policies were linked to the industrialization interest of the government. And liquidity was withdrawn from the economy to something that is called legal reserves requirement. I think it was used all over the world in the between 1940s and 1960, and mainstream textbooks argue that it's a way to reduce the money multiplier, which is not true in our economies. It was used to impose commercial bank to send credit to particular sectors that the government wanted to develop. This means that if they lent money to farming activity, which they wanted to develop, the legal requirement, the amount of money for each peso of deposit was lower than if they lent, for instance, to the car industry, especially the foreign car industry, which they didn't want it to be to use domestic finance for it. So it was a means of challenge of channeling resources to particular productive sector. The main challenge here, sorry, Chanay, was to generate domestic saving. This is something that at least in Latin America they faced. And here, another very important characteristic is that government determines the main prices, mainly interest and salaries. Before leaving this topic, I think we need to state that the bank-based system had different results, or the direct state intervention, sorry, had different results in Latin America and the East Asian experiment, were completely different. In the East Asia, public spending finance, private and public investment. There was low domestic consumption and high net export. This is something that is, I think, makes the big difference, that the Asian industrialization started or was able to develop with current account surpluses. Not always, but in general, it was much, the surplus was much higher than in Latin America, which usually was in deficit. And this is because they started from a lower process of industrialization. They started to industrialize the more simple sectors, and then they went up. And also they went way back into the process of industrialization. If they wanted to industrialize, the famous example of South Korea, that when they started to produce cars, they bought cars in the Western economies. They separated, they put them apart about 10 times to understand what was in the technology in order to develop their own. This never happened in Latin America. So industrialization went from simple to complex production activities, including capital and intermediate good. Another very important issue is that economics groups were created in the process of industrialization. The famous Saibatsus and Kereitsus, in which capital market mechanisms were strengthened, and they were very keen in generating not only bank credits, but all the more sophisticated capital market finance, in order that it will have a little less in government spending. There was strong regulation. This is another very important issue, to prevent external capital flight and luxury imported consumption. We know that in those countries, people couldn't buy foreign reserves, and it was hardly penalized if somebody was caught buying dollars. In Latin America, only the south part were limited to buy dollars, which actually they were able to. They were doing it not legally. Well, we have to be in mind that this process took place in period of closed economies with fixed exchange rate, although we had all these famous IMF doctors which came to Latin America and imposed regulation. We should say about this system in conclusion that domestic finance mechanism was created along with endogenous economic growth. I think this is the important part of the South Asian experiment. What happened in Latin America? I take Van Silver's stand, where he argues that in Latin America there was a truncate industrialization. What does it mean? Industrialization initiated by substituting final goods, and and capital and technology, sort of capital and intermediate goods were important. And there was a subsidy by the government of buying the imported goods necessary for production. And this led to a structural current account deficit because food and the primary goods in the period of industrialization went down. So there was a problem with a very weak external market. Another very important issue is that foreign corporations dominated the dynamic sector. Based on foreign obsolete technology, it was a big scandal that you can read people like Caput or Rodriguez and others saying that all the technology that was not used in developed countries because of competition, it went out very, very fastly, came back, was used in our economies, which led to low productivity with reduced export sector competitiveness. In this context, we argue that public sector subsidized capital and intermediate imports, and public policy didn't develop domestic technology. This was amazing. Public Development Bank and Trust unfolded accommodative monetary policy and had a very prominent role in financing private and public sector. Economic groups didn't develop in our in this part of the world. The structural deficit was a major feature that continued from the previous economic models. And the other big problem, which Kaldor and Kaletsi wrote a lot about it, was the weak structure, tax structure and low public utility prices. So continuously the public sector had to subsidize the private sector. The outcome of this organization was that the easy model was based on a very high income concentration that operated with low private investment coefficients. Domestic private sector was extremely low due to the luxurious capital consumption, and also we need to add capital flight. In this sense, I recommend to read Kaldor on Chile and Kaletsi on how profits in this kind, in our economies, the problems that they had. So this is the part that I want to devote to the organization of financial structure. Then I go to the main features of the Mexican economy. I have data here from 1960 to 2017. What you can see here that consumption, well, first of all, the economic growth rate. Here's GDP growth rate. You see, was much higher in the till the 1981, which is, well, the golden period of the EC period was till 71, and then you had all the oil findings in Mexico, which increased very much here, but in general was higher and less unstable economic growth. As you can see, what happens from 1991. Here you had the famous, in the 1980s, the lost decade, yeah, was the transition to globalization. Globalization started more or less in 1919 when the capital market, when the financial account of the balance of payment was open. And then you have the first financial crisis of what has been called the neoliberal period. And here we had the 2008 crisis that wasn't a financial crisis. It was a crisis of the export sector that export dropped very significantly. So here it's in the red, it's the growth rate that you can see was much better in that period, and it's less favorable in this period. here, the green dotted line is the trade balance. You can see that all over this, except in the last decade, it has been negative. It's only the trade deficit. And I think the most important feature of the Mexican economies is the way invest composition behaved and export. You can see that from 1994, more or less, the investment coefficient is lower than the export coefficient in a period that you are organizing towards maquilas, which is concentrating export on the basis of very high technological commodities. The car industry, all the technology, the TV sets, and all these things that it's in the north part of the country, which is considered very highly technological commodities. However, the value added is very low because they're only assembling parts. So this is a very, very brief photograph of the Mexican economy. Here we have it in numbers. This is 1960 to 1981, which we can call the famous easy period. Yeah, here is the rate of growth, which is quite high. Imports, this is the issue. Imports are very, very high and are, in terms of trade, they are sometimes, they're above, no, here they're below exports. The trade balance is here. Here is the last decade, which is the period that was the transition between the easy period and the export-led model. And here you can see that imports started to, that exports started to increase very much. Government started to withdraw from the economy, and fixed investment was reduced. And here what's been named the neoliberal export-led model, whatever you want, and these are growth rates, sorry. Here are the, with respect to GDP, which is easier. Here you see all the, here I think I'm missing our 9. And here you have all what happened in this period, and now in today, that you see again that what I want to mention very much, I want to stress, look how low is the investment coefficient. And now we go to Mexican insertion in the global market. What I want to say here, it's more or less easy. Here we have the, in this, the green, we have the, well, here we have the current account that you can see it has been continuously in deficits from the 1990s to the 2020s. And also we can see that the trade balance was only in surplus in the 1980s, and then it turned constantly in deficit from the 1990s onwards. And here you have the rent balance, which is the profit remittances of big firms to their parent companies, which has been very much in deficit, and transferences, which is the workers' remittances, which has been increasing. And actually in these last 2 years from COVID onwards, they have been the savers of the economic system, because the money that came from abroad has reached historical levels. And here is the financial account composition. You can see that in the 1990s, the main capital entrance was in terms of what I called other, which are credits, other assets. This is the name that it has. And well, you have FDIs, but the usual FDI that you came to build companies in the country. And in this part, we have the, well, the foreign portfolio investment collective was in existence. In the 90s, you can see that the situation changes completely. Other assets are very, very small. And here you have that foreign portfolio and foreign direct investment dominates capital entrance. Here you have also what happened in the 2000s, which mainly was based on FDIs. And you can see that in the after the 2008 crisis, portfolio investment dominated capital interest because it's the period of quantitative easing when liquidity in developed countries needed to valorize, and they came into our economies because the spread margin between the our interest rate and the US interest rate was enormously high. Yesterday I was saying that Mexican monetary objective interest rate is 5%, and as we know, the US is around 0 and 0.25. So if foreign investment comes into the country, yeah, they gain much more than by buying public instruments than in their own economies, with that stance of the central banks to stabilize the exchange rate. After the US closed the period of quantitative easing, but closed temporarily because they opened the gate with COVID, you can see that FDI dominate the scene, but there are interesting studies here that FDIs is really made or has a lot of components of very short-term capital that it's credits among firms, which is really a very short-term capital and highly unstable. So here it's the composition of the capital account. Well, here I just look at it in terms of total liabilities. And here I wanted to show that total liabilities, external liabilities, are 3 times, sometimes higher than the needs of current account finance. So you open the economy, you bring a lot of internal financial flow, and these financial flows are not able even to be absorbed in the domestic economies and are well above the requirements of current account payments. So here you have, this is the main issue that you can see in our economies. And then I think that you can find it at least in the biggest economy, which is Brazil, Argentina. Well, Argentina now is a complete different situation, but Chile certainly, which is the most open country, and Mexico. In terms of net financial accounts, here you can see that foreign portfolio were very, very important when just the economy was open up and in the period of quantitative easing. And here again, I want to remind that FDI, it's not really long-term capital. It has a lot of components of short-term capital. This is more or less the stance that I wanted to show of how operates the Mexican economy. And the final thing I want to say here is that external debt comes mainly, well, not comes mainly, but the private composition of external debt is increasing, which means that big corporations are getting indebted in the financial centers to not to increase fixed capital, but to stabilize their profit. There are lots of papers that we have written in terms of showing how the big enterprises are getting in debt in the in the US and usually in developed markets, and how public debt is going down. So more or less, this is the count that I wanted to show in terms of the Mexican economy. What have been the monetary instruments in the Mexican economy. Money was created out of printing money, sorry, till 19. I usually get confused. I think it was 54. I hope I haven't confused it with 45 because I'm kind of dyslexical here. So money came out of printing or making coins, what's the machine procedure, till the middle of the 20th century. Then it was money was created as a government long-term security that were held by commercial bank reserve. This was the other things when they started to shout that money printing is inflationary. So the government or public policy resorted to create long-term securities. We have to also be in mind that this period, and this is important of today's conclusions, that there was a fixed but adjustable exchange rate. As we know, the Bretton Woods was dominated this period, and you had that the countries couldn't devaluate unless the IMF gave the permission. Also, we have to take into account that there was stable interest rate, but in terms of bond and stock market, it was almost inexistent. As I've been arguing, the experience of the industrialization in Latin America didn't create indigenous economic growth. And this is the same for big and small countries. The main problem, I think, that needs to be considered out of this period, that industrialization never went to the more dynamic sectors. How it operated? Well, central bank controlled commercial interest of bank deposits and loan interest rate. What does it mean? That there were caps in the interest rate of deposit. They couldn't put it above certain volumes in order to control how much are paid in rents. And there was some regulation in terms of a lending interest rate, but it was mainly put on the deposit rates. And then it was very important, as I told you before, the policy of legal reserve requirement, which was very, very complicated. Banks inside the country have lower legal reserve requirements than in the big cities, depending, the interests were very important in terms of which sector you were financed. I think there is one, okay, sorry. And then you had all these rediscount facilities, which was very important in terms of channeling private credits, channeling credits to the private sector. And there is a whole set of selective credit policy. We have written a lot on that in terms how the government managed to channel credits what they wanted. What was the impact of that? Central bank asset was a lot of credits to the government, a lot of credit to public trust, and credits, obviously, the central bank acted very importantly as bank of bankers. In terms of the liabilities of central bank, there was deposits came mainly from the lending of reserve requirement, and you needed all this because there were very low taxes, and actually the government sometimes came into arrangements with the public, with the private sector, certainly the banking sector, which didn't pay taxes. This was the way of negotiating of the government for them to do what they wanted. This was more or less what happened in the easy period. What happens, okay, let me go to the next one. What happened in the globalized period? So, well, we know that in Mexico, monetary policy inflation target started to be enforced in 1994, the same year that the central bank got their autonomy, and was completely in operation around 2008, 2009, where the objective interest rate was imposed by the central bank. So the target rate of interest is a major instrument that uses the government that's on from, as I said, from 2007. How it's imposed? Well, the financial market conditions are an essential part of it. And here is exchange. The most important reference for the central bank is keeping the exchange rate stable. It's something like going to the chart. We need to stabilize the exchange rate. This is an extremely important variable because it determines inflation very easily. Obviously, the inflation and production gaps are considered on the other side, but this is much more stronger. And in terms when you open your economy and you depend on external foreign inflows, liquidity management turns into a very important part of central bank operation. On one stand, you had that the assets of the central bank, as I will show later, are made mostly of international reserve. Credit to banks have been important, or haven't I will put it in another way, haven't disappeared, but have been shrinking very much, and they have been replaced by repos, very short term credits. And this will, as you will see, will affect the liabilities in the banking and financial non-bank sectors. So this part of the story will resemble in the private sector liability part. On the other hand, you have that in the asset, in the liability part of the, on the liability part, balance of payment, by balance sheet, yeah, you have that a lot of treasury deposited at the central bank. So what does it mean? That all the money that is approved for the government to spend in each year, yeah, it's obviously deposit in the central bank, and the government continuously is on surplus in order that they won't run into public deficit. So the government is limited in their spending in order to create or to maintain surplus here. The other parts of the liability of central bank are monetary regulation deposit. And here there is a big difference between the monetary regulation deposit in pesos and in bonds, in government bonds. And also you got the BREMS, which are the bonds that issue the central bank bank to regulate liquidity. And this will show in the asset in the banking and in the government. So let's go and see how the central bank operates. Here you can see the importance from 1990 of international reserve. You can see here, well, here are total assets in terms of GDP. What is amazing is that in the 1994 crisis, which was a major financial crisis and the only financial crisis that we have had, yeah, the bank's balance sheet didn't increase. On the contrary, it reduced. So it was a pro-cycle economic policy. Here you have the 2010, now here you have the 2008 crisis. Again, well, this wasn't a financial crisis, so you needn't need a lot of central bank intervention. But you can see here the amounts of international reserve in terms of total asset, which more or less dominate central bank assets. In terms of bankers, credit to banks, yeah, which is the gray line. Since 1994, governments are not allowed, a central bank is not allowed to lend to government, which has been increasing, but again, you can see it has been substituted by very small finance mechanisms to a commercial bank named repos. So more or less, this is the picture that we have on the asset side in the whatchamacallit, in this in Mexican central bank. Let me make this a bit smaller. Let me make, see, no, wait. Sorry, 1 second. I want to see. No, here. Sorry about that. Here, I just put it in terms of different period. International reserves, as you can see, is going up and up and up. This period is the quantitative easing era, which is, as you see, almost a bit above 90%, which is a lot. And here you have, well, bond holding, which stopped. And here you have credits that the central banks gave to a commercial bank, repos, and well, all international organizations. I put aside 2020 because it's a different situation, but more or less resembles the same thing. International reserves dominate the central bank assets. It's the way money is created. Here, the interesting part is the liability side. Well, here it's currency. I'm not going very much into it. Here are the central bank bonds, which they were in operational around a couple of years in the 2000. And you can see that here, the monetary reserve deposits are having a very important stance in terms of managing liquidity. The big step was that monetary regulation deposit based on pesos, on cash, has been substituted by monetary reserve deposit based on government debts. And this is very important because it has been a way to subsidize commercial banks. Here, the argument is that the foreign reserves are so important in the Mexican economy, and actually private commercial banks dominate the banking sector as well as the non-financial sector, that they can impose their regulation or their interest on the central bank. Having monetary regulation deposit based on government bonds means that they will get the interest, which are very high, around 5%, but they keep the bonds and they can use it to finance other activities of the bank. Because of this, it's so important. They have a similar mechanism in Brazil. However, it operates on repos. It doesn't operate directly on government bonds. So here you have this show. And here I just did the same thing. And I'm arguing that there is a contractive monetary policy, yeah, because you can see the importance in terms of GDP of the monetary deposit regulation. Look how important they are from 2010 to 2020. This is the main issue that I want to show here. And here in this part, you have treasury account, the treasury and current account and the central bank that has been continuously in surplus. I want only to recall that the government is entitled to get lending from the central bank around 1.5% of their current account. But they have never used this credit from the central bank. Contrary, they're in surplus. And this means they're not using all the resources that are entitled to do in order to keep the fiscal stance in equilibrium. So this is the main issue of showing this slide. Well, what has been the result of it? Obviously, negative internal credit, especially from the government to the central bank. The government, instead of getting finance, is lending money to the central bank. And this has been, in a very slight way, the same for the governments, from the banks sector, bank institution net credit, which was in surplus more or less to 2010, and then in some periods it was also in negative, in deficit, and it has been also used from 2017, and amazingly, this was the same in the middle of the COVID crisis last year. So this is the impact of central bank managing liquidity. Here, I only wanted to show the amount of monetary regulatory deposit based on government bonds in terms of total government bonds in circulation, which is increasing quite enormously from 2014 onwards. And it's very, we will see in 1 minute, that has provided good returns to the commercial bank. So here, yes, I did that. Here are the cost of monetary regulation liabilities. Obviously, costs are quite important here. We can see the amount of payments for government deposits, which it's only on the current account deposit and government deposits. Also in the monetary regular deposit, which is quite high, this deposit. This is in terms of total cost. Mainly it goes to the government, and the government pays commercial bank the interest that they hold in government bonds. So here you can see that it hasn't been very neutral. The costs are very high of managing this monetary policy. What happened to multiple banks? Yeah, what we see if we see the balance sheet of private commercial banks. This is the total assets in terms of GDP. Here we have deposits, investment on bonds. You can see it's quite high, the amount of bonds that are in the asset side of commercial banks. These are securities. And here we have total credits. Total credits are sort of low in the Mexican economy. Mexican banks are not very keen in lending money because they get profits in their investment in bonds. So there is a problem of not a bad signal for commercial banks not being interested in lending money. And we have to acknowledge also that big enterprises don't get in debt in domestic money, in domestic currency. The firms still, these are small and medium firms, finance. And here we have the same, but in terms of time, between 2000 and 2020. And here we have that this is total credit portfolio, securities and derivatives. And see here the importance of investment bonds. This one I wanted to show in this graph. So we have having a problem that we are increasing the amount of bonds that is in the belly of the big commercial banks, for which they get very high returns. Very easily here I calculated bank returns of ROA and ROE, which is returns over asset and returns over equity. Returns over equity are in the right hand side, and these returns over assets are in the left hand side. And you can see it has been increasing. It didn't become negative in the 2020, lower, but it didn't. It went down, but for the amount of the crisis the banking sector or the banking sector really didn't suffer from the COVID crisis. Here is the distribution of net operating surplus in the financial sector. Again, here we see that the captive financial institution and money lenders, depository institution, which are the commercial bank, get most of the profits that are distributed within the financial sector. I meant also to show, but I thought I wouldn't have enough time, what is the situation of the stock market. And what we can see in the stock market is that we have a very small stock market. There are about 140 listed companies. The turnover is very low in the Mexican stock market, and it's not used, something has not been at hold. And what we see in the financial sector is that government bonds are that bonds are increasing. Public bonds are very important and are increasing significantly the bonds issued by private firms in the financial sector. This is the part that is increasing most. What does it mean? Again, it means that the private sector is getting in debt in the foreign market to maintain up their surpluses. What are our conclusions? When Mexican financial organization didn't develop domestic market mechanisms, this led to foreign external flow dependency. Monetary policy change. In the easy period, the central bank created liquidity to credit issues, to commercial banks and governments, along with legal reserve requirement to keep central banks' balance sheet in equilibrium and channel credit to the productive sector. In the export-led model, which is the globalization and internationalization period, liquidity depended on international reserves to stabilize the exchange rate, along with sterilization mechanism. Private finance, which big corporation depended on international market liquidity, bond issuance in the international financial sectors. Here, I would argue that international reserve volume was above domestic absorption, therefore sterilizing mechanisms were needed, and net internal credit, especially from the government sector, turned negative. Sterilization mechanisms limited government spending, and monetary regulation deposit was based on government bonds, which generates very high profits for the banking sector with virtually no risk. Central bank management is highly costly. Most of these returns go back to the banking sector, subsidizing the private financial sector. The question now to be asked is what to do. An important thing, I would argue, is create the finance in domestic currency. And yes, we need to expand our non-financial system and our financial non-banking sector, stock market and bond market, in domestic currency in order to rely less on foreign inflows. I would argue, these are my final words, that financialization of making financial relations more complex enters through the external market, enters through the financial account into the financial sector, and this needs to be reduced in order to develop all the financial mechanism inside the economy. This would be I will finish with this comment, and I hope we have comments now.
Yes, please.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this insight into Mexican economy. And while we are collecting the questions, may I ask you, how do you think this final conclusion, final recommendation of yours, how does it fit to the existing international agreements, namely NAFTA agreement? Can you do that without changing the NAFTA agreement and other international agreements which Mexico has?
Well, it's not NAFTA now, it's the MEC. I don't know what's it, it's the Tratado Mexico, whatever. The MEC wants to, it's in the north part of the country, and it's more related to production, to car industry and all these exports very linked to the US. I would argue that today, Mexico is as dependent to the US as the US is dependent on Mexico. In this industry, I acknowledge that the US has much more freedom to develop other sectors. In terms of finance, I think, especially in the situation that we are today in terms of COVID, that we can develop much more domestic finance. One thing that we're very limited in Mexico is engage in external debt, because once external debt increases, especially with the government that we have today, the external interest started to shout and shout, look how responsible you are. And immediately the big companies will downgrade Mexican bonds, well, would increase the risk of our bonds. So you have to be careful in incurring in debt. This is one thing. So you can finance domestically, yes, you can limit it. You have to be careful in how much public external debt you get, and you have to rely increasingly on taxes. Again, we have a very big discussion how to launch a tax reform for the rich to pay more. There is a big outcry from the left today to the government that they're not imposing higher tax to the rich. The government did, I think, a very wise thing. Started to forced big enterprises to pay their taxes, which they didn't do it before. So I think I told you that the income tax has grown in Mexico in about 4 points GDP, which is a lot. And they're looking the way of making a tax reform, trying to keep the big capital calm, because they will cry out their heads here. So what, in summary, what they're doing? They're trying to move their finance in domestic currency, which is good. Secondly, they're trying to spend more, but they're trying to recollect more taxes in order to prevent getting in debt. It's not bad going into debt, but again, we need to remind Kaletsky's lectures of the problems that the capitalist interest cries out when the government starts to get indebted. They don't like government doing that because they take the three means, the three ways of getting unemployed. I don't remember how the paper's names. I think Ricardo is with us. He would remember the name of the paper. And that the private sector is making a big outcry against that. So we're trying to move in increasing spending, not getting into debt, trying to keep the equilibrium from higher taxes from the rich, not from the poor. And there is I think in the future, the only way out is increasing debts in domestic currency and coming into agreement with big private capital of getting in debt in domestic currency. I think this would be very important. And this was something that was done in the Southeast Asia. And well, we can see how China is operating, which is very interesting that way. I don't know if I answered your question. Sorry, I don't hear you.
So thank you very
Your
much.
micro.
Thank you. Georg, please.
Yes, hello. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. I've got a question on, what is to be done from like an international angle. So I'd like you to imagine that you're a philanthropic investor in Europe who wants to do some good for the Mexican people, who doesn't really care so much about returns. What would you encourage them to do? Would you think that like European investors can't really make a difference, or can only make things worse by causing currency inflows in foreign currency to Mexico? Or like one thing that I think Jan Toporowski sort of hinted at that might be a good idea is to invest in government bonds in domestic currency, in pesos. What's your take on this? Thank you.
I don't like philanthropist. I prefer regulation. I prefer a change in the international financial system regulation. I think we're going towards that. It's not feasible what's going on today. Actually, foreign capital has come into Mexico and invested in public bonds because the returns are very high. I don't believe in Soros. I don't believe in all this kind of people. I believe that you can make arrangements. You want to come into our country? Okay, first, you transfer technology. You don't get in debt in foreign currency. You use the domestic financial institution, which is, I think, is very important. Try to, and this was a success of the Southeast Asian country. Yeah, we don't want favors from the international capital because we have to repay them in a very high cost. This would be my argument. Therefore, we need to push a different international arrangement. There are lots of things that are being done. Like now the US is very concerned because China got very involved in our economies in terms of investing a lot, and they're trying to prevent it. Yeah, they will have to give things in order for our economies not engaging with China. I think we need to use our power, yeah, in the international organizations in order to get best opportunities. This would be my stance. I think we need to limit this financial capital coming into our countries just in the interest of getting higher returns. I don't believe in this Madre Teresa, this nun. I don't believe in this. She wasn't so good, and she didn't make very much of good. So I prefer to lay down things and negotiate with big capital. We have been speaking, for instance, with the Indians and with the Chinese, how they managed, yeah, to bring FDIs in their countries and force them to transfer technology, force them to use domestic financial countries. This is the things we ought to do, and to be less scared about international retaliations. Yeah, the Mexican government and the central bank is something amazing. They have in their heads only the issue of exchange rate stability. I understand that this is extremely important in terms of the Mexican economy, but it's not the only thing that we need to do. This is my stance.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Gunnar, please, a question from South Africa.
Thank you, Prof, for the beautiful lecture. I would like to ask a question regarding East Asia and how the example of East Asia is hard to replicate, particularly South Korea, is hard to replicate in other countries of global South. For instance, Ben Fine and others show that South Korea relied, unlike Latin America, they did not rely on foreign investment, you know. So local capital played a key role, but they did borrow from foreign markets, and they were given easy access to credit in capital markets by the US. This was in the context of the Cold War, and there was a transfer of technologies in the 70s, and all of this has never been done anywhere else, you know, in the world. It was part of the Cold War to encircle China. So others are saying the South Korea model is not replicable to many of the developing countries, precisely because of how the US helped them build their own capital markets in order to drive their industrialization, something, and access to technologies as well, and even transfer, something that has not been done anywhere else. How would you comment to that, Prof?
I hope I won't outrage you. I don't think we can go back to nationalistic closed economies. I think I'm among the ones that think that globalization came to stay. The problem that we have to model globalization now, the problem that we have to negotiate much more around globalization. In this sense, this is the first thing I would say. You're completely right that the Southeast Asian industrialization took place on the basis of another class alliances. External capital interests were not so important, were not so dominant as in Latin America. Latin America opened up to foreign capital against domestic interests, which didn't happen there. This was the failure of the industrialization model. But I don't think that today we can replicate even the success of the Southeast Asian model. I think we have to be innovative today. I think we have to play in a global structure. I would argue it will be much more regionalistic. And in this sense, we are not very lucky because we have to dance with the ugliest country and the biggest countries, which is the US, which is not easy to dance with. So we need to negotiate and to show that what we can offer is good enough for them to come, but on the basis of other arrangements. For instance, we have to fight for food autonomy. We cannot rely, we cannot depend anymore on basic grains from the US, although they're produced cheaper there. We have to have ours, yeah, in order not to depend. We have to stand to, for instance, Mexico now is trying to specialize in being a port of transportation, a point of transportation. There is problem with the Canal of Panama, there is problem with in Egypt. So Mexico is trying to open a new wave through that links the Pacific to the Atlantic. That can be very important, but also it will engage with the South, which is Chiapas and the most empowered part of the country, in order that they will start to produce and engage in development. I would like to see much more public investment, which you haven't seen because the government's extremely too much cautious with the shouts of private sectors, but they're trying to do things. For instance, we need not depend on terms of energy or on gas to the United States, which we are highly dependent, although we export petrol. So there is a contradiction that we have to solve there. What I would argue then is we have to negotiate in the international arena or in the regional arena other arrangements. And I think this is a time which can be a bit more favorable for us because it is understood that the model as it is, it's not, how may I say, it's not, the capitalist model is coming into from one crisis into another. So it's realized that something needs to be changed. The problem is what will be changed. We are in a very dangerous situation like the 30s of the last century. How to go to another productive model which endogenous economic growth can take place within an international arena. I don't see, we are not a country as big as Russia that can close itself, and they have food, they have grains, they have meat, they have raw materials that can have their own source to growth. We don't have this possibility, especially with 3,000 kilometers bordering the US. It's a difficult situation in how to negotiate, but we need to do that. There is no other way out. We cannot go as the previous policymakers in Mexico, and I hope it wouldn't come back again, to ask in the international area, what you want that we will make for you to come, to invest to our countries. I think we have to set our priorities and from then negotiate. I don't think we can close TEMEC. There is a big fight in Mexico that there are some people in the left saying, just forget about NAFTA, TEMEC. It's crazy. If we do that, we left all the north part of the country, which has no development. It has lots of employment, low wage employment, but still are employments. But we cannot close that from one day to another. We need to go towards it, but very slowly. We need to make that foreign investment will bring some development to our country. And this is through negotiation. And this is true. The government beings have a stronger position in the international arena in order to negotiate and not just ask what they want us to do in order to steal everything what's inside the country. This has been the main issue in Mexico, the corruption. I wonder whether I answered your question.
Yes, Prof. Satisfactory. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It is my regret that we have to finish our lecture for now. And we need to, I will miss very much these communications with Mexico, with Professor Levy, because the insights, the ideas that you shared with us was very useful and very demanding as well. So I will hope we will have the chance to discuss it, to debate it perhaps in some future. And let me congratulate you for this lecture. Let me thank you for this lecture from snowy Moscow, which is below zero now. Thank you very much. Thank you to you and to all those who are present here. Thank you very much. See you.
It was my pleasure to be with you and to discuss in this time of lockdown that you cannot go out. It's nice to see and be able to put forward your idea, and I hope in future discussion. Thanks to everyone who has attended this lecture.
Thank you. Bye.